In this lesson, we're continuing our discussion of relevance, and specifically we want to focus on character evidence under rules 404 through 405 and 412 through 415 of the Federal Rules of Evidence. But to get started, what is character evidence? Well, in short, character evidence is simply generalized information regarding a person's behavior. And we know under Rule 405 of the Federal Rules of Evidence that character evidence can come in through one of two different forms, right? We have reputation and opinion testimony, and we have specific instances of conduct. So reputation and opinion testimony would look like a witness taking the stand and saying something like, in my opinion, having known the defendant for 20 years, I believe he is a violent person, right? Or you could talk about reputation. Maybe the witness doesn't know the defendant personally, but does have personal knowledge of the reputation in the community. Witness takes the stand and says something like, hey, having grown up in the same community as the defendant, I can testify that he has a violent reputation in our community, right? Anything that looks like that is reputation or opinion testimony, right? So, and it doesn't have to be negative character traits. It can be positive character traits. It can be negative character traits. The witness could take the stand and say something like, in my opinion, I believe the defendant is a peaceful person. In my opinion, I believe the defendant is a good parent, a bad parent, a safe driver, a reckless driver, right? It can be anything describing generalized character traits or generalized behavior, right? They're a good driver, they're a bad driver, a good parent, a bad parent, a safe driver, a reckless driver, right? Whatever it is, if it's generalized information regarding a person's behavior, we really need to think about character evidence. And again, that type of testimony where someone's saying, in my opinion, this person is blank, right? Insert any character trait you want, right? That's reputation and opinion testimony. It's also important to recognize, though, under 405, we know we can also have character evidence come in through the form of specific instances of conduct, which would look more like a witness taking the stand and say, hey, I know the defendant is a violent person because I saw them get into a bar fight last week, right? They're actually pointing to a specific instance of conduct. Hey, I know this defendant is a bad driver because I saw them run a stop sign last week. Hey, I know this defendant is a dishonest person because I saw them lie on their resume 2 years ago, right? These are specific instances of conduct, right? So important to recognize the distinction that character evidence can come in through simple reputation and opinion testimony, which is just, in my opinion, I believe the defendant is a dishonest person, versus specific instances of conduct where we're actually pointing to a prior action, right? Where the witness takes the stand and says, hey, I know the defendant is a dishonest person because I saw them lie on their resume 2 years ago, right? So we have character evidence through the form of reputation and opinion testimony in specific instances of conduct. So one thing to note when we're thinking about specific instances of conduct, right, is Rule 406 of the Federal Rules of Evidence carves out a distinction between specific instances of conduct and what we call habit and routine practice, right? Anytime on a fact pattern, right, if you see more specific, right, remember we said that character evidence under 404 is really more about generalized information regarding a person's behavior. If you see very specific information regarding a person's behavior, for example, every time I get into the car, I put my seatbelt on, right? That's describing a habit. Or every time a phone call comes into our office, our secretary marks it in our call log, right? That's a routine practice of the business. And habit and routine practices do not fall under 404. Habit and routine practices are generally admissible, right? To show that a person acted in accordance with that habit or routine, right? They had their seatbelt on because that's their habit. They always put on their seatbelt every time they get into the car, right? So it is important to recognize the distinction between generalized character traits, in my opinion, I believe this person is dishonest, or I think this person is dishonest because I saw them lie on their resume, right? We need to draw a distinction between that and 406, habit and routine practice evidence, right? And the buzzword to look for on an evidence fact pattern, here's the trick, right? Anytime you see always or every time, it usually is an indicator that that's a habit or routine practice, not character evidence. So if you see always or every time, usually that's a large indicator that that's actually a habit or routine practice under Rule 406, not 404 character evidence. And habit and routine practices are generally admissible, right? So important to recognize that distinction. Sometimes it can be difficult with specific instances of conduct and habits, but again, you're looking for more specific actions that are repeated, right? A habit, something you do every time or always, right? Where specific instances of conduct are usually more describing one-off events that relate to a generalized behavior, right? So want to draw that distinction. Again, look for, as your buzzwords, anything like always or every time. That's usually the indicator that you have habit or routine practice, not character evidence. But moving on, right? So once we understand what character evidence is and we really can distinguish that from habit and routine practice, the next question is, well, how do you actually approach a character evidence analysis? Once you've issue spotted it, we see that we have someone who is giving information of generalized information regarding someone's behavior. We think we need to discuss character evidence. We've issue spotted it. What's the process of the analysis? Well, typically I say that there's 3 steps we need to take. There's 3 variables we need to know before we just run into the analysis, right? So the 3 things that you want to mark kind of in the margins of your paper or highlight, underline, make sure that you understand before you just start analyzing character evidence is going to be, number 1, we have to establish whether we have a civil case or a criminal case. Number 2, we need to establish why the character evidence is being introduced. Is it being introduced for propensity purposes or non-propensity purposes? And number 3, we need to identify the form of the character evidence under Rule 405. Is this reputation or opinion testimony or a specific instance of conduct? Because we'll see if we're analyzing character evidence under a criminal case, that distinction will be important in our analysis, right? But we can just start with civil cases and really go through these 3 gateway issues, right? So the first thing you need to do before you jump into it, right? Number 1, what's the first thing you do when you're doing a character evidence analysis? We need to, number 1, identify whether we have a civil case or a criminal case. This should be pretty straightforward, right? If we have a plaintiff suing a defendant for damages, breach of contract, a negligence action, right? That's a civil case. If we have the government or the prosecution charging the defendant with a crime, that's a criminal case, right? That should be pretty straightforward, easy to see on a fact pattern, but definitely worth circling or noting because I have seen students kind of confuse the rules. We do want to recognize that the rules for a civil case and the rules for a criminal case are completely different. So we have to, number 1, establish, do we have a civil case or a criminal case? So mark that, highlight it, that's step number 1. Step number 2 is to identify why is this character evidence being introduced? Is it for propensity purposes or non-propensity purposes? So what do we mean by propensity? Well, we have to ask, why is the character evidence being introduced? Are we introducing the character evidence to show that this person acted in accordance with that specific character trait on a particular occasion? If we're doing that, we say that we're introducing it for propensity purposes, right? So another phrase I like to use is this up here on the board, this fill in the blank statement I have at the top of the board, right? Understanding this is really the key to a character evidence analysis. Because he is blank, insert any character trait you want, he had the propensity to blank, right? If this is what is happening, right? If this is why a party is introducing generalized information regarding a person's behavior, this is what is generally inadmissible under Rule 404 of the Federal Rules of Evidence. We do not like these types of arguments being made generally, right? This is what is generally inadmissible. Think about it. This is a pretty prejudicial statement. Because he is a violent person, he had the propensity to commit murder. Because he cheated on his wife, he's a dishonest person, he had the propensity to commit tax evasion, right? Because he ran a stoplight last week and is therefore a bad or reckless driver, he had the propensity to negligently cause this car accident today, right? This type of statement, this is what we call propensity purposes, right? We're introducing the character evidence to show that this person had the propensity to act in accordance with the alleged character or alleged character trait. This is what we do not like, right? And in fact, in civil cases, the rule is very easy. You're not allowed to do this unless one of two exceptions applies, right? You are not allowed to introduce character evidence for propensity purposes in a civil case unless one of two exceptions applies, right? So it is, the key to understanding a character evidence analysis, so I just can't stress enough, is this statement, right? And this is where students often get confused. We have to, number one, identify is it a civil case or a criminal case? Number two, is it propensity purposes or non-propensity purposes? Why are we introducing the evidence? Is it to show that this party had the propensity to act in accordance with the alleged character trait, or is it for some other reason, right? And notably, if it's being introduced for non-propensity purposes, we're introducing the character evidence not to do this, but to do something else, to prove something else other than propensity, then 404 really isn't at issue. Now, you'd still want to discuss it on your evidence essay, but it's not what 404 is addressing, right? 404 is addressing introducing character evidence for propensity purposes. So if you're introducing it for some other reason, our starting point rule is, well, generally you are allowed to do that, right? That's the other end. So that's why, right, the gateway issues here are critical. Number one, is it a civil case or a criminal case? Number two, is it propensity purposes or non-propensity purposes? If we're dealing with a criminal case, we'll also really want to note the form of the evidence. Is this reputation or opinion testimony, or is this a specific instance of conduct? But we can run through civil cases, see how this plays out. Once we understand this idea of propensity, which I think we have a good idea of at this point, we can see how that plays out in a civil case and how it plays out in a criminal case. So the idea here, though, is once you establish those three variables, right? Number one, is this a civil case or a criminal case? Is this evidence being introduced for propensity purposes or non-propensity purposes? And you identify the form of the evidence. The rest is just plug and chug. You just have to memorize some procedure, some little decision trees, nothing complicated. Literally, the rest of the analysis, though, is just plug and chug. So if you, on your fact pattern, identify those three variables, you should be in great shape. Number one, is it a civil case or a criminal case? Why is the evidence being introduced? Is this for propensity purposes or non-propensity purposes? And what form is this? Is this reputation or opinion testimony or a specific instance of conduct? So on our fact pattern, let's say that we've identified those three things and we're dealing with a civil case. How do we now move forward and actually analyze it? Well, in civil cases, the rule is very easy. Character evidence is not admissible for propensity purposes unless character is an essential element of the claim or defense, or the case involves a claim for relief based on the defendant's alleged sexual assault or child molestation, right? So the rule here, if we have a civil case, is very easy, right? Neither party is allowed to introduce character evidence to show propensity unless character is an essential element of the claim or defense, or we have the second exception. But we can break this first one down first, right? So what do we mean by character being an essential element of the claim or defense? Well, this first element should make a lot of intuitive sense, right? Some types of claims or defenses require that we show character evidence, right? The claim itself, an element of the claim, actually requires a party to produce character evidence for propensity purposes. For example, the most classic example is a defamation lawsuit, right? In defamation lawsuits, one of the elements of the claim is going to be that the plaintiff has to show harm to his reputation, right? So how is he going to show harm to his reputation? Well, he's going to call character witnesses, right? Plaintiff has to call a character witness to say, this is what his reputation in the community was before the defamatory statements. This is what it is now after the defamatory statements. We have to, though, put up character evidence to show that there was harm to his character, right? That there was harm to his reputation. It's an essential element of the claim or defense, right? So if we have something like a defamation action, negligent entrustment, it could be a child custody, right? Child custody cases, sometimes character of the parents is at issue, right? If it's an essential element of the claim or defense, right, then we're going to allow the character evidence to come in civil cases, even for propensity purposes, because we have to. Otherwise, the plaintiff would not be able to prove their case, right? Now, the second exception is just a straight exception that you have to memorize, right? If the case involves the defendant's sexual misconduct, either sexual assault or child molestation, then you're allowed to introduce prior instances of sexual assault or child molestation for propensity purposes. You can actually do this. You can say, because the defendant has committed sexual assault in the past, he had the propensity to commit sexual assault against me. Or because the defendant has committed child molestation in the past, he had the propensity to child molest me, right? Or whatever. Forgive the bad phrasing there. But the idea is simple, right? You can introduce the evidence, the character evidence, for propensity purposes if we're dealing with the defendant's sexual misconduct in sexual assault cases or child molestation cases. Just an exception to commit to memory, right? But otherwise, right, in a civil case, if neither of these exceptions apply, then neither party can introduce character evidence to show propensity. Now again, if we're introducing the character evidence for some other reason, not to show propensity, that will be allowed. That's not what 404 is addressing. Remember, 404 is addressing propensity character evidence. Non-propensity character evidence is outside the scope of 404, right? So we'll talk about that more in criminal cases when we get here, which we're going to talk about in 1 second, because it's more prevalent where we see evidence being introduced for non-propensity purposes when we get to this discussion of mimic, right? But we can move past civil cases into criminal cases, right? I think this is pretty straightforward. Civil case, it's just one rule basically. All we have to know is that character evidence to show propensity is not admissible unless one of two exceptions applies. Now, this is a little bit different in criminal cases, right? In criminal cases, we say that the prosecution cannot introduce character evidence for propensity purposes. However, the defendant is allowed to open the door, and the defendant can present character evidence. Thank you so much for watching this video preview of our Legal Education Accelerator Program, or LEAP for short. If you would like to see the conclusion of this video and gain full access to our entire 1L and 2L video library, integrated outlines, streamable audio versions, additional practice exams with explanations, and much more, we invite you to head over to our website and join the thousands of law students who have already enrolled. To get started with your no-risk free trial today, simply click the link in the description box below or visit www.studicata.com/leap.
Hi everyone, my name is Serena and I'm currently a law student at South Texas College of Law, Houston.
Hi everybody, my name is Shiva and I'm currently a law student at Southwestern. Hi everyone, my name is Michelle and I am a first-year student at South Texas College of Law, Houston. I used the Studicata study video series last semester to help me prepare mostly for contracts, and I actually made an A+ in contracts last semester, which I greatly dedicate to the Studicata videos.
By using Studicata to help me prepare for my final exam, I was able to score the highest grade out of my class on the final, and even have my essay distributed as the model answer. Not to mention I had done quite poorly on the midterm and was struggling throughout the whole course of the semester, understanding the material and keeping up with lectures.
Because of the Studicata video lectures, I was able to go into my exams with a feeling of confidence. I didn't have to worry about what the rules of law were or how I was going to organize my answer to an essay question.
I would absolutely recommend the Studicata series and their online course materials to anyone. I think that they are not like professor lectures that you might find online or other outside study materials that you may encounter. I think that the Studicata videos really focus on not only ensuring that you understand the material that you're going to encounter on your final, but they also help you to understand kind of the best method for test taking, and they really break down how to approach each problem and the best ways to tackle certain methods on testing, and I think that's really important, and I think it's really special. I don't see that anywhere else in any of the other online resources that I've found. So I would certainly recommend Studicata to anyone who is studying in law school right now. Good luck on your studying, and you're going to do great.
I would definitely recommend Studicata to anybody watching this video. Give it a chance. I'm positive that you will love it, that you will get a lot out of it, and that you will be happy that you gave it a chance. I definitely am. I know I will be using Studicata in the future.
And I cannot thank Studicata enough for getting me through my first semester of law school. I will definitely continue to watch the Studicata video lectures throughout my law school career, and I highly recommend that any future or current law student do the same.